Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another exciting episode of Clinic Gym Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Josh Satterlee, and I'm with the doctor of how to move heavy things, Josh Henkin from DVRT Fitness. Josh, how are you?
Good. Thank you for having me. I don't know, though. You already set forth the expectation this is going to be exciting, so I'm a little bit nervous now.
All right. Well, I'll do my best to, even if we stumble through the swamp, I'll be excited about it. You know, like, this is going horribly.
Sounds like my whole career, so we're good.
Well, Josh is not only an instructor for all things moving heavy, what would you say? Moving heavy items that don't want to cooperate. That's kind of what your program's built around, right?
Sure, yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
And he's also the inventor of the ultimate Sandbag and developed that. Yeah, man, I'm really excited. I've heard you speak a couple times at Perform Better, and I know you are all the way down with the idea of blending the clinic and the gym, so we got a lot to talk about.
Sounds awesome. Can't wait.
Yeah. So let's start out. Can you give me a little background of how you came up in this game and what started you out?
Sure. I growing up, my sport was basketball. I was one of those just basketball junkies. So I would spend the summers just, going to basketball camps, practicing, spending every day at the courts. And then when I was around 14, I suffered a really bad ankle injury that was pretty devastating. I basically, growing up in Chicago, we'd play at the parks a lot, and I went up for, I had to tell people it was a 360 dunk, but it was really just a layup. And there was a crack right underneath the basket, and I landed around that crack, turned my foot all the way upside down, ripped everything in my right ankle. And so basically, it was to the point where when we got to the emergency room, the only time I saw my stepmother get announced of being sick by the sight of something is when the doctors turned my foot almost all the way around. And that almost did it. So they weren't sure, how well I was going to be able to walk again. So, I had the typical, at least 12 weeks off that. And so for the first little bit, I was, being grumpy and self-pitying. And then eventually my older brother said, we're going to knock this off. So he had just gotten into weight training. And actually one of his best friends growing up is actually a name you might know, was Mark Crabtree. And Mark later on did a lot of strength conditioning work with some pretty cool facilities. So I remember going to the gym with them, and the first thing that every teenage boy does goes right to the bench press. When the bench press, my brother, staying over me just with the bar, I get pinned horribly, and I'm wavering there, begging him to get off. And being a brother, he's just laughing and seeing how long it'll take. But after that moment, I just actually ironically fell in love with it, the idea of strength training, because it was unlike sports, as you well know, and I would find out much later on that at a certain point with sports, no matter how hard you work, if you just don't possess the skills or the qualities and athleticism, you're just not going to keep moving forward. But I found with strength training that if you put in consistent effort and you came in with a plan, generally you were rewarded, and that was kind of cool to me, because it didn't take much longer after that. I found out I didn't have the athleticism to go really far, so I really started to lean on more of a strength side. So. That sort of else gave me the idea. At that time, we had a high school strength conditioning coach that both my brother and Mark were really good friends with, named Tim Lang. And Tim Lang at the time was assistant strength conditioning coach for the Chicago White Sox. And so I had this great mentor. I didn't know there was this thing called strength conditioning. You get paid to train athletes. What a cool gig that is. Mm-hmm. So I knew right off the bat I wanted to do that. So everything, Tim had, and this is just when functional training is starting. And he had, I remember, a medicine book by Vern Gambetta that he gave me. And so this is so cool. So I had a kind of a cool jump start to the whole functional training and strength conditioning side. So I went to college with that in mind, that I was either going to be a strength conditioning coach or I was going to be a high school coach that coached basketball. And, I always tell people it's a story that will bore most, but I accidentally walked onto the Arizona State men's basketball team. And, during our off-season conditioning, that's when an injury that had happened actually 6 months after my ankle injury, I had basically herniated 2 discs in my lumbar spine, came back with a vengeance. And I remember we were doing single leg plyos, just landing, just bounding. And upon the third jump or so, I just felt that lightning bolt go up my leg. And that was when I knew things are not good. This is not good. And so the doctors looked at my spine. When I was 14, I was told that you're going to have problems as you get older. That time they looked and go, this is going to be problematic. So I spent, the rest of the year, and people don't know, I'm sure some people know how college athletics work. It's much more of a business, right? And as a walk-on, you're very expendable. So I would go to the team physical therapist. They'd be like, Josh, only practice 20% of the time. Well, you go to practice, the coaches are like, oh, you can't do anything. I'll just get someone to replace you. So, you end up practicing the whole time. You go back to your physical therapist. You go, well, what did you do that? You go, I did the whole practice. You go, why did you do that? Well, it was basically Abbott and Costello routine. I'm like, well, so, and eventually during doing some sprints, my right leg gave completely out. And I remember just, arriving on the court, just horrible pain. And part of the pain was physical and part of it was just knowing this was it. I was done. Wow. And just right after that, the team doctor said, we can't, allow you to continue to play. So they unceremoniously retired me, but I was still in bad pain. And, that sort of burned my sort of excitement for basketball. So I started, focusing on the strength and conditioning side. And so I wanted to know everything there was to know, because first and foremost, I just wanted to help myself. Because at 20 years old, I'm sitting there in class, I can barely sit in a chair. Walking's difficult, doing things that, you think a normal 20-year-old could do. It was very problematic for me. So I started going to internship programs and continuing education programs.
Now this is down in Arizona. Is that what you said?
Yeah, this is in Tempe. I'm at Arizona State.
What time of the year is this? Or sorry, what year is this?
This is 98, 97. Okay. I know I'm old. But this is actually.
No, I'm about the same age. So this is good.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember Muscle Media 2000 was a popular strength.
Man. Bill, what's his name?
Bill Phillips, right?
Yeah.
And to Bill's credit, he brought about sort of strength conditioning to the mainstream because he brought in a guy named Charles Polkwin. Yeah. Charles was the first non-bodybuilding coach. He was the first strength conditioning coach to really be in bodybuilding magazines. And so I'm like, with the stuff he was talking about, like, what is this? I've never, even being in school, I'm like, I've never heard of this. So I just started taking every course I could. I internship with Charles, spent a lot of time with Charles, and whenever he would mention a different name, I'd go that's how I found out about Paul Chek back in the day. So,
well, it's funny because you were in Arizona in, let's say 98, 99, 2000. I mean, a lot just happened to be going on in that area. I mean, athletes' performance was developing. Yep. I'm trying to remember all the little gyms, but it became for a while there, it was like the performance hub of the United States, right? Like just strangely, a bunch of people were there and around there that happened to know a lot about strength and conditioning.
Well, Arizona had the luxury of being a warm climate. Well, very warm sometimes, but also being quite inexpensive compared to LA and so forth. Right. So a lot of people set up the facilities. Yeah. Like you said, there was Brett Fisher who's still there that trains a ton of pro athletes. There was a bunch of different.
Ito was down there, right? Daryl Ito.
Yeah.
I can't remember the gym he was at before AP, but tons of those places were
so it was awesome to see and learn, and so that really started getting to shape a lot of it, and so that basically was my trajectory. I'm like, but then I saw a lot of my friends who were in the strength conditioning industry, how miserable their lives were. I'm like, I had one friend, it wasn't his fault at all. It was just the nature of the beast, where within 5 years, he was at 3 different schools because the football coach gets fired, the whole staff gets wiped out.
Right.
So between the pay, the hours, and the stress, I'm like, this doesn't seem right. I'm going to pick something more stable. So I decided fitness. That was a dumb move, right? What's the thing less stable than strength and conditioning? Maybe fitness. But for whatever in my head, I had it that, I could do it my way. I'm sure, you can relate. I was going to do things differently and, fell on my face about 20 times. But that was sort of the start of, getting in the industry, making tons of mistakes, but learning a ton along the way as well.
Now, was this still down in Arizona?
I was in Arizona. I was in Arizona for about 20 years. So, as in the last 4 years, my wife and I moved to Las Vegas. So outside of growing up in Chicago, I spent most of my time in Phoenix.
Now you're best known for the Ultimate Sandbag, and that I'm sure you invented it about 25 yeyears ago, but it's gained a lot of popularity in the last 10 years, right? And I've heard your Perform Better speech, and if anybody wants to, number one, I would always recommend going to Perform Better Summit. They're an incredible place to learn because you stumble upon things you never ever would have considered, and that's how I found Josh here. But can you take us on the journey of why you thought you needed to develop a new tool? I mean, because you were in fitness at the time where the new tool was kettlebells were kind of up and coming and the secret thing, right? You were back in the early 2000s. that's when plyometrics and Don Chu and Vern and all these guys were kind of developing that as who's the guy at University of Oregon?
Radcliffe.
Yeah. Dude, I saw that guy at the NCAA or the NSCA conference in Spokane jump over somebody on stage. That guy had
he's a bit athletic.
He's unbelievable. Yeah. Anyways, but you started seeing that, and at a time where there's a lot of publishing going on too, whereas previously there hadn't been a whole lot of publishing about kind of the conditioning aspect or the more performance-based information, whereas before it was just, what's his name? Bill Pearl's Keys to the Universe kind of stuff. Here's how to do 14 variations of bench press. So how did you get into thinking about, hey, I need to develop a new tool here?
Well, for a long time I did. And, I had opened up a gym around 2002. And, I always tell people the first thing I bought was this really souped up power rack. And people have to understand, like I, at the time, had a background. I competed in some Olympic weightlifting, even with my back issues. And then about that time, started getting really into strongman. So I was doing some competitions then. So like our gym was very eclectic. We had a ton of stuff, but I never dawned on me.
As long as it was heavy, you had a bunch of it.
We had, I was kind of a bit of a junkie in retrospect. That was a bunch of mistakes because looking back, I made probably one of the biggest mistakes I could tell people I made in opening my facility is initially I made it for myself rather than my clients. But there was no program there. It's just, you just did what, you had known through going through other internships. But anyways, so like 2002, I'm going through an internship program, and the gentleman I'm going under goes, "Hey, you got to check out this kettlebell thing." And I'm like, I go online and I look at him like, kind of looks like what I could do with a dumbbell. I don't get it. He goes, "Trust me, do it. You won't regret." So, I buy not being confident of what this thing is. Like the lightest kettlebell at the time, which was like 8 kilos, which is about 18 pounds. I had a VHS tape, if that wants to date me a little bit, to try to learn the lifts. And I'm going through this, and I'm like, I can do the movements because I have a lot of the actual moving isn't too unfamiliar, like hip hinging and squatting. But the thought process behind it, some of the progressions, the way they were using the implement was very different. And I saw an opportunity because one of the things I struggled with from the fitness side is I believed I wanted to take the concepts from athletic-based training and bring it to general population. But they obviously didn't have the movement coordination. They didn't have the mobility. They didn't have the athleticism to really do a lot of this stuff. So like, how do we make this accessible? And it started to come to me that this kettlebell thing could be a solution. So in 2003, I went through my first kettlebell program. And I always tell people what made me fall in love with it was none of the secret Eastern Soviet, mysteries or so forth. I really fell in love. Like the first sentence that came out of Pavel's mouth was, we're not here to teach you how to use a kettlebell. A kettlebell is just a vehicle to teach you our system of movement. And up to that point, having gone through all these programs, I never heard someone talk about movement. We were still very much muscles and lifts, right? What muscles are we working? What lifts do we do? And strength conditioning was just like, you had these standard lifts. Everyone did them, right? Without question. So going through that program, I was so excited to like learn this whole new concept and way to think of it. It was one of the first times I had a big breakthrough on my low back too. So, having this passion, wanting to know everything after the course, I go to Pavel about what do I learn? How do I learn this more? He's like, you got to read the old stuff. And I'm thinking the stuff from the 70s and 80s. And he's like, no, like the early, late 1800s, early 1900s. And for those that aren't familiar, the reason he has suggested that is there was an idea of physical culture at the time where actually it dates back to the Greeks. And actually it was used in later on in Soviet propaganda during the Cold War, was that physical fitness was a part of the entire human. Right. That you weren't a good quote unquote citizen unless you had physical fitness too. So, it was part of philosophy and science and math was physical fitness. Yeah.
I mean, that movie, the documentary movie, 300.
Yeah. So there's definitely an element of that.
Yeah.
Right?
But Sparta took pride in the fact that they were, prepared at any moment, right? They were, their physical abilities were as high as their mental abilities.
Absolutely. And so, what you see back then is not only appreciation of the more holistic way of looking at the body, but, people were doing gymnastics and wrestling while they were also lifting. And so the thing I always laugh at is when people, try to take a hit at functional training and they're like, oh, it's no different than, just focusing on muscles. It's like back then they even had quotes understanding that our body was meant to be one unit. Our body had these chains. Like there's a great 1924 book about muscle building from one of these strongmen that talked about like, you can't get strong without training the muscles in groups and the way they're supposed to perform. So even back then we had the science and somehow we totally missed it. But to go into like how we got to the Sandbag though, was the problem was
to give those people credit. In the 70s, they also came out with polyester, which is not comfortable, doesn't deal with sweat well, and you can't iron it or wash it. So they weren't missing the boat just on athleticism.
No,
I mean, there's a lot of boats.
I won't be a style critic anytime soon, but yes, absolutely. But the hard part, obviously, without something like the internet, was they obviously had an issue with communication. So when people talk about things like, oh, this is not how they did in old time strongman training, it wasn't like there was some unified system that everyone was using. It was just basically this guy thought this guy thought that.
Yeah.
So, one thing I think I have a decent ability to do is try and connect dots. So I said, okay, what are the commonalities that all these guys are saying? And then in one form or another, they all talked about actually stabilizers and stability training and why that was so important. And their way of sort of communicating a lot of that was through lifting odd objects that, because they had unpredictability in their movement, you had to sort of, figure out more efficient movement patterns.
Can we pause real quick? Because I know you're a bit of historian in the world of strength. Looking back on some of those early books, what were some of the things that shocked you about the ability to do? I mean, like, because if you train as a bodybuilder, you can't do some of the things they talked about. But I mean, like back in the day, bending steel bars and I can't remember the inch. Is it the inch dumbbell? And he would do that crazy like windmill type press with it. And there's some things that I've seen pictures of going, I don't know if anybody could do that today.
No, I mean, the thing is, like, fitness then wasn't as popular, mostly because of what you're alluding to, that manual labor was still a big part of our life. So there didn't seem to be a need to do exercise. Right?
And these strong things were like, they were put on display. They were shows, right? Like they would be at the boardwalks and things like that. They would demonstrate these feats of strength to large groups as part of entertainment.
Yeah, you can say like these were the first professional athletes in a sense because they would travel in these circus and they'd be doing performances, and part of their performance was strongman acts. So yeah, that was the antithesis, and especially some of them that they would also do wrestling matches and they would do other things too. Because I mean, wrestling was, if you look at the history of fitness, wrestling was part of the very first Olympics in Greece. So it's like some of these things. But if you look at what makes up wrestling, it actually makes a lot of sense, right? A lot of mobility, stability, coordination, and power, strength, like all happened at once. And we totally got away from that. But that inspired me. And so, being a former athlete, all you have to do is tell me something is the hardest thing to do. So in one form or another, they talked about like a bag of something. So, I go and do what probably a lot of people could relate to is I got an Army duffel bag, some garbage bags, did my first homemade sandbag, and with 80 pounds, it kicked my butt. And so I was like, oh, okay, this is awesome. So what does any good coach do? They're like, now I'm going to kick my clients' butts with this thing.
Right.
So I made a whole bunch of other bags, and clients loved it at first, but within probably about a month's time frame, we started seeing some glaring issues. One was I was treating it at the time like a barbell, just like it was just another barbell. So, initially the shock and the novelty of the item was cool, but then we didn't have a way really to progress because you're not going to put 2.5 pounds more of sand in your sandbag, right? And then we didn't have outside of just being difficult, what are we actually teaching people? So I started okay, well, let's back up a second. Let me read everything I can find on sandbag training, because as the internet loves to remind me, I didn't invent sandbags, which I never claim I did, but we're going to get into what we actually did to create, which was a system. And so I just, to my surprise, there was actually very little information on sandbag training. Probably in all the books I could find, there was one book dedicated fully to sandbags. It was about 40 pages. It was mostly just exercises. And most of them had a chapter of 5 to 6 pages of oh, you could do this. This is good too. And it was really hard to find anything concrete. So I was about to abandon the whole idea when my buddy goes, what would you do differently if you could create something? I'm like, well, I don't know. I don't make equipment. I'm a coach. And so, everybody's got the buddy that knows a guy. Yeah. So my buddy's like, well, what if I have a guy call you? And so basically, long story short, a boat cover company in Chicago, ironically of all places, called me and was like, hey, your buddy told us that you had this idea for this sandbag. What would you do? So basically, it was a very rough version of what we have now. But what started to happen is I started to think okay, if we were going to abandon a sandbag, then we had to say, is the problem the tool, the system, or both? And at the point with the homemade sandbag, I really thought it was both. Like the tool didn't allow, I mean, think about it. If we do any type of serious training or therapy, we don't go, hey, I'm going to make this at home and then use it on people. But apparently,
Graston tools kind of like that, right?
Where that, but you see how they've evolved, right? Like kind of the same thing. And so it was one of those things like, hey, if we have the right tool, then we start having to build a system. Like, what are we actually trying to accomplish? Like the sandbag provides an opportunity for very unique attributes. So how do we maximize that? Because it doesn't actually show itself if we treat it like a sandbag or like a barbell. So that's where the system started coming in, and we just basically started to use it with clients to go, wow, if we do this, this fixes that. So then it became, wow, like this actually makes our job as coaches better and gives the clients faster results. So it became less and less about the implement, but what the implement taught people about how to move their bodies better.
So go back to that first, when you worked with a guy from the boat cover company, what was the capacity of the first kind of set you had built? Was it like all 80 pounds, or was it a 20, a 40, 60, and 80?
I remember the first one we did was rather small. I think it was like up to about 40 pounds. Okay. And then I went to like a bigger one. So I think it went up to maybe 100 pounds. But I had no idea how to make such a thing. And so it was the whole side of manufacturing was a whole different process that I learned outside of just coaching and just a whole bunch of details that probably bored most people, but things I would have never considered.
You have handles, you have webbing, you have Velcro, you have zippers. What else do you got? I mean, you got a ton of stuff going on, like very different modes of manufacturing, and then a bag that is meant to be freaking filled with heavy stuff and dropped from height, right? Like that's the worst design that's the worst thing you could ask for a bag is like, I'm going to fill it with really heavy stuff and then basically not take care of it. Yeah.
To go off of that, when we started working with, better companies and they had engineers looking at what we had, they basically said that like, oh, you want this thing to be resilient. But, a lot of times, for example, if they do a drop test, they just drop something to see what its tolerance is. You can predict because the load's not changing. It's, pretty stable, the shape's not changing and so forth. So that, with the sandbag, obviously it's changing a little bit. So that gives a challenge, but we also had to answer the challenges of like, okay, well, how long should a handle be? Where should it be? How far from one another should it be? How does that change
what direction should it be? Parallel to the bag or perpendicular or and then you got both, right?
Yeah. And then the length of the handles, if it's too long, does it change the mechanics of the exercise and, things like that. And then it was even like, how big do we make them? Because, we tend to take it for granted that typically a barbell is 7 feet long, but why is it 7 feet long? Like,
I'm sure it has some ridiculous reason, but you ever
probably less than people think, because if you go back to the origin of the barbell, which was like in the early 1900s, developed by a equipment company, the whole goal was they wanted a dumbbell they could put two hands on.
Okay.
And so you have a barbell. And the barbells you look at the time were mostly about 5 feet long because metal was very expensive, right? But as something gets longer, you can add more load because you can't do it when it's smaller, right? So when you start to add more load to something, you become more load centric. You stop moving as much. Now you have this implement that's largely sagittally plane based that is used actually for a very specific number of things that actually goes against 90% of the implements we have in the gym when it comes to how we should be programming. Because if I ask you,
talk more about that.
If I ask people in the gym, okay, which implement actually physically changes its load? The answer is the barbell. Dumbbells, you just have more of them. Kettlebells, you have more of them. Medicine balls, you have more of them. Bands, you have more of them. So my question becomes, why are we programming for the 1% when 99% of these implements function differently? So then that started me down the road of like, developing the system a little bit more holistically, like how do the principles and concepts translate to a lot of things, and is the way we're looking at programming kind of off because we just tend to replicate what we were taught when we were younger, and we never question, well, is that the best way of doing it, and does that make sense off the science that we have today?
Are you looking to get into the tennis crowd locally? Then I would highly recommend you check out RacketFit.com. Now, RacketFit is designed by the same crew that brought us to TPI, Titleist Performance Institute, but it's designed around the game of tennis. Now, if you know anything about tennis, you know that it is a fantastic pool of patience because typically tennis players can pay cash and they can come in for performance care. It's everything that you want in a patient. They show up to appointments, they're easy to deal with, and they've got money. So highly recommend you check out racketfit.com so that you can serve those tennis players better. It's all about the assessment of tennis and the moves that the players have to make, and I can't recommend it enough. So check out racketfit.com. How many iterations has your Sandbag gone through?
Well, I like to, joke that we're like Iron Man Mach, 25 or something, but I sort of lost count, I think, over 10. Some of the changes were subtle and some of them were more dramatic, but, it's just a byproduct of going, what's the best thing we can create, but also offer it as a price that people can afford. Sure. If we have $1,000 Sandbag, probably not too many people are going to be able to buy that.
Thank God you don't ship it full. I mean,
right? But we get that question a lot. Like, why don't we do that? It's like, well, shipping will kill you. But yeah, I mean, it's been a lot, and a lot of it was also me when we went to better manufacturers, like, we had better materials available or better abilities to do certain types of stitching.
Yeah.
Like, for
what's
example,
something somebody could look at on the new ones that, maybe didn't exist in the first couple?
Well, the biggest is just the material that we use. We don't use a fabric. We use a high-density vinyl. And the reason we do so has a couple of reasons.
Because you knew the coronavirus would come and you wanted to make it wipeable?
There's a funny joke about, well, it's not really funny joke about that because it actually happened. One is obviously what you just said. Having the ability to wipe down stuff is super important, obviously, in clinical settings, but even in fitness, right? I don't want to. So it's funny, the U.S. Air Force a couple of years ago started ordering all their Air Force bases could only order through us because they had gone to a cheap fabric route and they got reworn. Yeah, which is not awesome. Yeah. That the vinyl's more durable. It's less abrasive. All these.
Plus,
things
it looks cool. It looks cool.
It looks cool, but it's also just when you grab onto it, it doesn't hurt. It's simple. I always say if we're going to ask people to do things that typically don't like to exercise, the actual use of the implement can't create an obstacle in of itself, right? Like you can't go, oh man, most people, they don't like to exercise, statistically speaking. So we go, hey, you're going to do this exercise. They already don't like the exercise, but now I'm going to give you an implement that makes you more uncomfortable. Well, that doesn't sound awesome. Yeah. So we found lots of things like that. The rubber handles came as a byproduct of, talking to a coach many, many years ago. He's like, Josh, I love your stuff for our boot camps, but when we do repetitive work, it just eats up in our hands. And so that was an obstacle. So like, well, can we make that better? So it was doing that while also being cost sensitive to, what would that do to our pricing? Yeah. And as a company, we've always had this pride of like, we're an education company with a piece of equipment, not an equipment company. So we wanted people to want to use the implement. So you have to make it in a sense where it's very user friendly. And now you can focus on the hows and whys rather than the implement itself.
Awesome. So now the smallest one, I mean, how many different sizes do you have now?
I believe we have 5. So, one of the aspects that people tend to overlook with sandbags that make it unique is there's a load component, obviously, but there's also a dimensional component. Yeah. So it's not only, hey, I want to use this because it's this weight. It's, well, does that size work for that exercise? So our smallest ones go up to about 20 pounds, as low as about 5 pounds. Our biggest one goes up to 160 pounds, which is yet to be a load issue for most people, even though 160 doesn't sound large compared to a barbell. We've had the strongest of people find that to be.
Get your 160-pound buddy drunk and have him pass out and then try and
pretty much, right?
You don't need it to go any heavier than that.
And that dimensional component obviously becomes much more amplified. Yeah. So it's understanding both the load side of it, but also the dimensional side.
Yeah. So after you had the product, you said you also started kind of developing the technique or the system around it, right? What were some of the early things you learned versus, now you're widely accepted and you have great training programs, but early on, what were you just, cause like I always laugh, you go to I don't know what it is, but with the kettlebell, the number one photographed or videoed exercise is that stupid ass sumo deadlift, high pull, pull the kettlebell up to your chin with your high elbows. I call it the impingement exercise, like bilateral impingement, but I don't know why, but for some reason, videographers love that move. I don't know if it looks good or what. And the least filmed is the kettlebell swing. The proper kettlebell swing, the way it should be done, just doesn't exist on YouTube, for God's sakes. I'm like, this is the craziest thing. Here's how to improperly use this tool. And the proper way doesn't nearly get the cred.
Well, yeah, I mean, to speak to that point, I mean, we battle, and we've been in social media since it's been out there, basically. But to your point, it's hard to balance the sexy to get people's attention with what's actually beneficial. Sitting there doing just the foundations that we have probably won't get the eyeballs. So I always say, and we don't do stuff that's obviously dangerous, but we always preface stuff like this is advanced, but we want to start a conversation like, oh, what is that? What are you trying to do? Like, where do I start? But
Hey,
for
dude, in
us,
golf, Butch Harmon said like the most important three things in any golfer: grip, posture, and alignment.
yeah.
And he said, but I've never had anybody walk in to get a lesson and say, can you work with me on grip, posture, and alignment? And it would affect everything, but nobody asked for it. They're like, I want to hit a high flop shot and then maybe work on my fade. And he's like, you don't need that shit.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny you say that because, again, now our first generation was 2004. We started, really offering in 2005. So 16 years into it, we still get much fewer questions over how to use it than can I throw it? Can I beat this up? How durable is it? I'm like, well, do you have that same question about your barbell, your dumbbell, your kettlebell? Like, what are you thinking you're going to do? So to answer your previous question was the biggest thing was just like, just to help people understand it's not a barbell and that the way we're going to use it's going to be different. So again, no fault to the person, but you tend to default to what you know. So when someone, people almost feel embarrassed to ask us, how do I use this thing? I would say that the number one question people want to ask but don't want to, especially higher level coaches, is what do I do with this? Mm-hmm. And so it's like once the value in it is basically what you do with it. And that sounds obvious, but again, a lot of people, as you know, are about, other aspects of the implement.
You could use a kettlebell for curls.
Yeah.
But that's not where it shines,
No. And so it's like, what is this going to be? I always tell people if I'm going to use an implement as a coach, I got to think about this is the best implement to do what I want. And this does it better than anything else. So I think a lot of people don't do that. And especially in the fitness side, I think a lot of people, they pick the implement first and the exercise, and then they try to make up a solution rather than, hey, what's the problem? What am I trying to teach people? And then what's the best tool to help people with that? And so that's basically where we started with. And just, we had to create a system. So we had to make all the mistakes. Like, hey, if we do this, then this happens. For example, we use the neutral grip handles when we deadlift or we clean. And a lot of people, because you don't have the option of barbell, they want to go that pronated grip. But the problem is, on a barbell, if you try to quote unquote break the bar, which is a cue you use to engage the lats and gain that stability. If you do that with a bag, because it's pliable, it just folds, versus we pull out the handles on the neutral grip and that locks in our plank so we can do hinges and we can keep people safe. So it was just basically making up the rules, but doing it in a sense that like, oh, this is the right way to use this piece of equipment. And so that meant a lot of mistakes too.
So real quick, if somebody's like intrigued by this and they want to find your product, find the education, where can they go?
I mean, the best place to go to DVRTfitness.com. And basically our website's packed full. We have tons of free blogs, probably an overwhelming amount of information. Obviously, we have the products and our education there. But people can also just email us through the website if they have particular questions. My wife is a physical therapist. So, between her and I, we can generally answer most people's questions upon where they're coming from and the type of training that they do.
And so folks know, what does DVRT stand for?
So it stands for Dynamic Variable Resistance Training. And the reason I wanted to have that was years ago, and I've known Alan Cosgrove, who's a very prominent fitness professional for about 20 years. And, I said to him, I need to have something that helps people get away from this idea of sandbag training, because they became over-focused on the implement. And unfortunately, they weren't focused on what we were doing with it. So we had to create a name of a system, because sandbag training doesn't mean anything. If you go to someone, I do sandbag training, I go, what does that mean? Like if I go say, Josh, I do barbell training, that doesn't mean anything. Am I doing powerlifting, Olympic lifting, bodybuilding? What am I doing? So we wanted something that emphasized our system. How are we using this? So that's how DVRT came about.
So it's DVRTfitness.com?
Correct.
All right, cool.
We have a really long URL, ultimatesandbagtraining.com, but I figured DVRT Fitness is easier.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So going back to the tool, one thing you realize quickly is, hand grip had to change, or, how people set up for an exercise may have changed. What are some other, can you walk us through maybe some modifications early on, the way you were doing things, exercises and now how you recommend them being done?
I mean, I think a great example is, having come from Olympic lifting and then strongman background, I loved, a lot of the Olympic lifts and their modified versions. So one of my favorite exercises was a clean and press. So initially, not, knowing exactly, how do we optimize this, we would clean the weight. So from the ground into the crooks of our arms, and then with our hands in front of the bag, basically. So the weight's in the crook of our arms, we'd press the weight overhead. And we found out very quickly that just sucked. That was not comfortable, didn't feel good on the shoulder whatsoever. Yeah. And it had to dawn on me, like, what was happening? Why did that suck? And if you think about, hey, if I'm going to press a kettlebell overhead, my hand's pretty close to my shoulder. Same thing with a dumbbell, even with a barbell. So, but if I hold the weight in the crooks of my arms and have the weight out in front of me away from my hand's now far from my shoulder. So I can't engage the lat to help give me that whole body press versus now I'm really loading up the shoulder. So now we're very adamant that people press with the weight upon their fists. Which is funny because it basically, when you ask people why do they want to use sandbags, they'll tell you because they're unstable. And you go, oh, okay, what does that do? They just look at you funny like, well, I don't know, it's unstable. But what people...
confusion, bro.
Yeah, exactly. And what they don't realize is what they're actually asking for is they want to increase movement accuracy. Because yes, you need to be strong, but just being strong won't allow you to move well enough to handle the unstable implement. So you have to be accurate with your movement as much as you do have to be strong and powerful. So it's funny, like the clean to fist can be challenging for people and they get frustrated. They're like, oh, this sucks. I'm like, well, I thought you wanted something unstable. So it's just one of those things. It's not drastically unstable. It's just, it's in very subtle ways because you don't want it to be drastically unstable, because just like unstable surface terrain has been shown not to increase strength and power, so would something that would be dramatically unstable. Like slosh pipes have been around forever, right? Slosh pipes hardly get used because they're so incredibly unstable. You can't use them for very much. You can't progress them very well. So it's just monitoring some of these variables like that, or, in a hip bridge, everyone puts weight on their hips. And if you understand how the body functions, that makes no sense because your glutes work with your lat and core in locomotion, that posterior oblique thing. So we actually teach people to hold the weight over their chest, pull the weight apart. Now engage the lat and core to work synergistically with the glutes. So it's a lot of those little things that make a profound difference at the end of the day.
Very cool. And what is the, what is a common exercise you see done that you're just like shaking your head like that's not what it's for?
Pretty much all of them. No, if I go on social media, my wife's like, "Don't look at the hashtags sandbag training. You'll just get angry." And I only get angry not because I have this need to be, right. I feel like Michael Scott. It's not as much as my need to be liked. It's just that people can hurt themselves, and then they write off the tool as like, "This is dangerous. It's not good." It's like, no, you're using it badly. So cleans are a big one that people just do brutally. Clean and presses particularly because people do exactly what I said is wrong. And the reason they do is because, well, they just saw someone else do it and it's easier, right? You don't have the instability. You've made that unstable and stable. Our lateral drags, where if you're in a plank position and we're dragging the weight across, people just throw the weight back and forth. Shouldering, people don't appreciate, is a very complex drill. Bring the weight from the ground to your shoulder. It extends the range of motion. You have to, you have this diagonal pattern. You have to resist frontal plane forces. So I just think people, it's interesting. My wife and I always say this, like, people give such great care when they use most training tools. And for some reason, this implement causes people to go mental. I don't know why. They just like abandon all sense of good movement principles, what they're trying to achieve. They just do stuff. So I would say that's probably the worst aspect of it.
I think the part of it would be the apparent indestructible nature of it. You can do anything you want. I see that as a general rule, like kettlebells to people appear indestructible. And I've seen people freaking drop them from like shoulder height, onto the floor and just move on. I'm like, dude, come on. Like that thing will bounce and hurt somebody or hurt you or fall on your foot.
And I've seen plenty of broken kettlebell handles.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll damage your equipment, which is not awesome either.
Yeah. Well, as a gym owner, you appreciate that. The people using them are just like, I'm sure there'll be a new one in here tomorrow. It's fine.
Yeah. Exactly. But people get hurt.
Yeah. But like, then you see the like super high end, like, the dumbbells with the rounds, you steel weights and the imprint and everything. And I don't ever see people drop those. And I wonder if it's like those look fragile, the sandbag looks like it, could put up with a beating. So
I mean, I understand where people are coming from in the sense that they, this looks like something very different and it behaves very different. So they tend not to give the same thought process. And I think maybe, like, to your point, it doesn't look dangerous to a lot of people. So they think they can just do whatever. And, I even years ago, I read an article in a muscle magazine, only because I was given it, where a NFL strength and conditioning coach was actually talking about sandbag training. And this logic made zero sense to me. He goes, well, sandbags by nature are unstable, so therefore technique is not that important. I'm like, that's what he said. I'm like, based upon what you just said, technique would be even more important because you have an unstable implement. So even people you think should know better.
A football is not a sphere, therefore throwing it doesn't take nearly the accuracy.
Like a baseball, right?
Yeah.
Or something.
Or weight. Yeah. That's the opposite,
Yeah. So it's just weird logic that people have. And so, and it comes from, again, just unfortunately, we live in the day and age where social media can perpetrate such horrible things, but it's just going to be a resource for people going, I don't want people to use sandbags. I want them to gain a benefit. And if the benefit is through using our sandbag, then awesome. That's what we want.
Well, that's my next question. So you guys did a great job of doing the fitness side of things. Mm-hmm. But your wife, as you said, is a physical therapist. And, coming from the clinic side, have you guys been building, my understanding is you have been building education to kind of bring that back all the way to the start of rehab, the skill set or the techniques for the rehab side of the house. Because I think there, my personal opinion is going to shine even more than the fitness side. Oops. I just dropped my cup on my computer.
Josh is now dead. It's okay. Yeah. We're all good. No, I mean, we have for the last several years, and it's funny, we started, I call it our non-corrective corrective exercise program. Mm-hmm. We just want to call it restoration because, like so many, I think corrective exercise, is polarizing as a name. Mm-hmm. To us, everything is just on a continuum, right? Mm-hmm. And when you're in rehab, you're at this far end of a continuum, which is fun, I think right?
People listening to this believe in that continuum. They're saying the clinic and the gym, there's no separation line between those. They're just, continuation or amounts of which one you're doing today.
Absolutely. And so we started going, okay, here's the movement patterns we ultimately want to teach people. Mm-hmm. How far back do we need to start? And then where do we go? So I think one of the biggest benefits of a system is it tells you where to start and where you're going. It's like a map, I tell people. Mm-hmm. You just have to decide how far on the map are you going and what's the most efficient way to get there. And that's what we try to do for people. We try to do it. And we try to use the implement as another coach, because a lot of times we end up asking people to do things that they just have no body awareness of. So how do you want me to do that? So if I can say, hey, Josh, instead of activate your lats, pull the handles apart.
Yeah.
That's going to be more helpful to the client. They're like, oh, because they don't even know where their lats are, right? If it's, hey, we're going to create better core stability by having you break the bag apart when you're holding it in your arms. Mm-hmm. Oh, now I understand how to brace. Now I have a better understanding how I'm going to create the stability when I squat or lunge. So it's using, cues that mom and dad could understand, but that are actually teaching very important, complex concepts. But that's why we started at such a foundational level in our restoration, but that carries through to our higher performance stuff. Like there is no difference. You're just changing where you are in the continuum.
Yeah. I think I want to give a shout out to Dan Swinsko up in Washington, because, he is a consummate professional in the clinician world, but he does a great job of, for whatever reason, I've been seeing him use your sandbag since the start of the year more than anybody else in my Instagram feed. But it's great because he always uses it while wearing a collared shirt, which he does. Think is a great.
He uses a pink one, so
it's a good blend of things. Yeah. But Dan knows what the hell he's doing. He's one of the best clinicians I've ever met. So along with that, I love your perspective there, because I think one of the things, if clinicians go back, and especially those with like more than 5 years experience go back, I think when rehab came out, when people started doing a lot of rehab, and chiropractors, typically we didn't do a lot of rehab, and over the last like 5 to 10 years, it's kind of been expanding as to doing the rehab as much as physical therapists. But maybe I keep saying 5 to 10 years, but I forget I'm old, so it might be more like 10 to 15. Anyways, what was one of the great parts about the kettlebell? If you think about a kettlebell, if you're going to have somebody do a Turkish get up and you have a relatively lightweight, let's just say a 20-pound kettlebell, it's providing that ton of feedback like you're talking about without them having to know what the hell it's doing. But, you're saying you're not going to you don't have to tell them like brace your core or drive your glute, but you're not going to be able to get up into the, ironically named get up, unless you do those things, and that kettlebell just helps provide that feedback source without having to to consciously attempt those things. And because of that, that's how real movement occurs. No baby in the world ever goes like, oh, brace your core and then press up, or, fire your deep neck flexors and then lift your head. It's like, that's just how we move.
Right. Well, I mean, now I laugh because, again, I've made all the mistakes myself. But now when I hear other coaches use cues that are meaningless, I tend to laugh, like engage your core, squeeze your glutes. Like, these are horrible cues. What does that even, like, why? And so it's now, if we can use tools, our training tools as teaching tools, then people respond faster, but they also start to use their bodies more. And so, and especially because some people are kinesthetic learners, they got to feel it. It's like, well, how do I get you to feel what I want you to do? And I want that to be an active process too. I don't want it to be passive.
Can you maybe share one exercise or rehab? I don't want to say corrective exercise, but one exercise done in rehab that the Sandbag really shines versus other tools that maybe you've seen that kind of fall off?
Sure. I mean, I think an easy one. People seem to love a host of our restoration drills, and one of them happens to be the dead bug. And I think we've all done dead bugs.
Oh God,
and
way too many.
and it's a great exercise. However, I think a lot of us can also appreciate when you assign that to a person. Usually, it's a show, and no fault of their own. They just don't know how to control their body. Mm-hmm. So as we give all these verbal cues, it doesn't fix it. I remember teaching a course, and I was talking all these trainers. I'm like, hey, we try to avoid having the rib expansion, right? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, so what do you tell people to do to not have that occur? We tell them not to put their ribs up. I'm like, well, does that work? They're like, no. I'm like, what do you do then? They're like, I don't know. I don't have a better strategy.
It's like people that assign glute bridges and say, well, the person can't fire their glutes, so I gave them glute bridges.
Yeah.
What do you think their first attempt is going to be? Because it's not going to be to fire their glutes,
So to answer your question, what we do is we use the bag as a feedback tool. So instead of having the arms and legs moving at the same time, is if you guys can imagine holding something about shoulder width apart, and we're going to hold it about, stomach to, low part of the sternum. We're going to grab out the outside handles because we know grip is related to rotator cuff and lats. Mm-hmm. We're going to now actively pull those handles apart, and we give a cue, I don't want a saggy bag. Now, when people do that, all of a sudden they create the brace. So now their ribs are down. They can now control their pelvis when the legs start to move. And then we can layer progression, whether that's now moving the weight a little bit more overhead, where we're changing the lever arm, now we're resisting more extension, or we start actually rotating the bag when you start developing PNF patterns into the movement. So that's one of the great ways that we apply this, because not only do we have now a feedback tool that's going to make you stronger, we have ways to add layers of progression that are going to add sophistication to that movement over time.
Yeah, I love that idea of no saggy bag, because that would early on in rehab, they could do that with an empty bag, right?
Very early on. If you had to, the nice thing about the bag, because I always get this question, can I do that with a band? Right? That's the question I always get. Mm-hmm. And I'll always be honest with people. If I think the kettlebell's the best, I always say, like, guess what the best tool for a kettlebell swing is? A kettlebell, right? Like, it's just not trading off equipment.
You don't say your extra large bag with a full of 160.
Although people will try. I don't recommend that. So, in the case of the band, what people don't understand, number one, I don't get the grip component, and the grip is really, really important. I get horizontal loading through the pull of the band, but I don't get the vertical loading. So the fact that we get both horizontal and vertical loading, that load makes me create tension. And that tension initially is really important for people to learn how to create stability.
So we're talking about feedback. You're getting one plane of feedback with a band, whereas the Sandbag is giving us that same plane of tension, plus the grip, plus the compressive force of the weight, plus possibly, if I move the band, if I'm pulling apart a band, I move it from my lowest part of my sternum now to above my forehead, that essentially remains the same tension. Whereas the Sandbag totally changes, like you're saying, into an anti-extensive force or feedback tool around anti-extension. So it offers you a whole lot more variables within there. Is that right?
Absolutely. And, the nice thing I always say is, like, a lot of people, if you have a 5-pound dumbbell, for example, they'll be like, oh, I'm going to outgrow that. And our thing is we'll never outgrow them, the size of the bag. We'll just use them differently over time. Yeah. So that's the benefit of knowing, like, having that system of knowing where you're going with things.
Yeah. I took the FCS course with functional movement, and we use them there for the farmer's carry, because if you want to get 50% of somebody's body weight, you're going to have to switch out. And if you can't do it with a fixed kettlebell, but they're like, just take that sandbag, open it up, throw a couple extra plates or kettlebells in there, and then walk around with them. Holy God, farmer's carries with sandbags are totally different than a stiff-handled object that stays rigid. I mean, I've carried them as much weight, but the dynamic nature of something as simple as weight hanging straight down at your sides was so different for me that I'm picturing that amount of increased feedback that I got from that drill on a low-level, non-intricate drill. I can only imagine what it's like when you get up into these higher-level, more complex drills, how much more of a rich feedback environment is providing your brain.
Yeah, I mean, I think people just miss some things that when I say it, people are like, duh, why didn't I think of that? Like, for example, if I do a deadlift with a sandbag, why does it feel heavier? People want to default to, well, it's unstable. No, it's moving a vertical point. It's not that unstable. It's what happens like with a kettlebell, right? If you row a kettlebell versus a dumbbell, they feel different of equal weight, because in the dumbbell, you're grabbing in the center of mass. Because the kettlebell has some of the weight away from it where you're gripping, you have a lot of the center of mass away from you, so it feels heavier. Well, in the sandbag, you have no weight in the handle, and as the bags get bigger, that gets amplified, so the length of pull is so much more. So like in a farmer's walk, you have all the center of mass away from your hand. So it feels so much heavier, and then you have a dimensional component. So in strongman, I was trying to explain this to someone on social media because they didn't understand things. The easiest thing to farmers carry is a trap bar, because it's one single piece.
Okay.
Right? If in competitions in strongman, they'll use these long bars that have a handle sort of similar to like the sandbag, where most of the weight's away from you. So the weight, if you move, starts to move too. So now you have to react to the weight moving a little bit too. So it's not this massive deviation, but it's enough to where you have to raise awareness to how you're moving your body. And then when you combine that with, hey, we have about 7 different ways that we can apply load to your body to manipulate that carry. Well, now we have a way that we can, if I want to put the weight on your shoulder, for example, now I have a walking side plank, like where I have to really resist that lateral plane. If I put the weight, in front of you where I'm holding the crooks of my arms, I can create tension. So now I have a front plank if I can't be as reactive when the weight's down by my side. So there's all these ways to manipulate the.
That's actually, with any tool, the sandbag or even kettlebells or held dumbbells, if you want to know what Josh is talking about, take any tool, carry it with your arms down at your sides, the farmer's carry. I mean, you have decent weight that will give you some work. Then move it into the double rack position, and then ditch half the load, but put the other load up on one shoulder, and you realize like that is doesn't follow a linear progression of the weight. In fact, it's, understanding that relationship. You can ditch half the weight and get a still more of an ass whooping.
Absolutely. That coincides with McGill's work talking about, that frontal plane stability being so essential. So it's, it's sort of one of those, it's simple, but so effective if you do it with the right meaning and purpose behind it.
Yeah. Well, once again, share the website with folks if they want to get more about this.
Sure. It's DVRTfitness.com.
All right. And you have courses, you said the restoration course, which is for those who are interested in the rehab, getting people back to fitness. It sounds like that's the course. And then you have the ones for the fitness going into performance as well.
Yeah. So, we've been teaching live courses for over 10 years. So what we found is over time, people are digesting information a little differently, obviously in digital formats, and people can't always get to things. So we started, putting it online. And my big hesitation as a coach, first and foremost, was, can we deliver the same quality in the online course? Sure. But then I started to think the downside of being in person is I'm limited by time. On an online course, I'm not limited by time. So we can actually provide people even more content because of that, avoiding that. So what we do, restorations are foundational, sort of like I call it the non-corrective corrective exercise program. Level 1 is our foundations of strength and movement. Level 2 is obviously more advanced multiplanar rotational training. But then we also have our LIFT program, which actually we start off stands for Loaded Integrated Functional Training, because I like acronyms. And that's basically how we show how the sandbag works with tools like bands, medicine balls, kettlebells, suspension trainers as a system. So not just, I don't know what to do today, I'm going to grab my TRX. It's like having a purpose of like, what's the best tool to use for where you are in your training. And then we just released our progressive kettlebell movement certification, which is my kettlebell certification based off the 7 foundational movement patterns. So we have lots of opportunities for people to get all that information online. They're all accredited through different organizations. So if people are interested in, can I get my continuing ed? We've never had a problem even in physical therapy type of and chiropractic associations.
Awesome, man. Well, Josh, I really appreciate the time today. Those of you who are listening, if you ever get the opportunity to go to Perform Better or see Josh speak and you want to try something totally different, I think it's fantastic. Get your hands on a Sandbag. I think it's just like a kettlebell. At first, you're probably going to say, I don't understand. This is just a heavy bag. But, man, I've had some great fun with it. So I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your expertise today. This is I think this hopefully will tweak the way people approach some rehab and some of their workouts. So thanks a lot, Josh.
I really appreciate it, Josh. And if anyone ever has questions, we're here to be a resource for people.
Thanks so much for checking out these videos. I hope they're useful. We'll cover things like rehab, exercise, business model, progressions, layout, everything else that helps you build a clinic. So if you're interested, you can click here, there, here, or anywhere to get more videos just like this. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you soon.